very much, Satyalila. So I love a good story, and I've wanted to share a story with you tonight. So a very long time ago, there lived a good king. He was one in a long line of wheel-turning kings, rulers who ruled well and justly according to the Dharma. As was the custom, at the start of his reign, this king asked the advice of his wise ministers and did his best to follow it. Sadly, he was negligent in one thing. He failed to give property to the needy. As a result, poverty became rife, and one man took what was not given. He was brought before the king, who asked, "Is it true that you have committed theft?" "Yes, your majesty," the man replied. "I stole because I have nothing to live on." The king was much affected, and he gave the man property, saying, "Good man, take this so that you can support yourself and your family and make gifts, which will promote your spiritual welfare and lead to your happiness for a long time." When people heard that the king was giving property to those who took what was not given, they thought, "Why do we not steal also?" And another person stole and was brought before the king, and then another. The king thought, "I must put a stop to this, otherwise theft will increase. I will have this man executed." And he ordered the man to be bound up with a rope, taken through the streets to the sound of a rough drum, to a place outside the city walls where his head was cut off. Hearing this, the people said, "The king has cut off somebody's head. We too can make an end of anybody we want." And they armed themselves with sharp swords, took what was not given, and then killed those from whom they had stolen. So from not giving property to the needy, poverty had become rife. From the growth of poverty, theft had arisen, and from the increase in theft, people had begun to kill. And these were not the only ills that beset the kingdom. People began to lie, denying that they had stolen. They denounced others. Envy spread, respect for elders diminished, and all kinds of covetousness and hatred increased. People became ugly, and their lifespan decreased until it shrank to almost 10 years. The word moral disappeared from the common language. And eventually things came to such a pass that people began to mistake each other for wild beasts. Bearing sharp swords, they thought, "This is a wild beast, I must kill it." And they took each other's lives in this way. Fear and degradation prevailed. But some people thought, "Let us not kill or be killed by anyone. Let us make for some grassy thickets or forest clearings or rivers that are hard to ford and live on roots and fruits of the forest." And this they did, each to their own hiding place. And after a good long while, they emerged and rejoiced at meeting the others, saying, "Good beings, I see that you are alive." And then the thought occurred to those people, "It is only because we became addicted to evil ways that we suffered the loss of our kinsfolk. So now let us do good. What good things can we do? Let us abstain from taking life. That will be a good practice." And so they abstained from taking life and practiced it. And in time, their lifespan increased and their beauty returned. And then it occurred to those beings, "It is because we have taken to this wholesome practice that we have increased in lifespan and beauty. So let us perform still more wholesome practices. And those people refrained from taking the not given, refrained from sexual misconduct, from false and idle chatter, from covetousness, ill will, and wrong views, and respected wise elders. In time, the population increased, cities and towns sprang up and prospered. There were few diseases, and people came to have an 80,000-year lifespan. At that moment in time, there arose in the world a Buddha. Reports spread that he was a graceful being, with a sublime presence, a universe of understanding and an incomparable teacher. Just as a mighty lion would make a great sound reaching out into the four quarters, he had set in motion the wheel of the true Dharma, which is lovely in the beginning, lovely in the middle, and lovely in the end. Some people left their homes and kinsfolk and joined together to follow him. And it was even said that on hearing his teaching, a certain king, rich and powerful, left his palace and distributed his possessions to homeless wayfarers, beggars, and the destitute. Shaving off his hair and beard, he trod the dusty road out of the village and went to join the Buddha and his company of followers. So that's the story. So that story, with a little bit of poetic license, appears in an early Buddhist text, a sutta or a discourse of the Buddha, and it's called the Cakkavatti-Sīhanāda Sutta, which means the lion's rule on the turning of the wheel. So the lion is the Buddha, who roars out his teaching like the king of beasts. And the wheel is the wheel of the Dharma set in motion by the Buddha when he gave his first teaching after his enlightenment. So that's the wheel that we're meeting this Dharma week. But in this sutta, there's also a slightly different type of Dharma wheel. It's the wheel that's turned by wheel-turning monarchs. So in ancient India, there was an idea that exceptional beings born into the world would take one of two paths. Either they'd be a spiritual leader, as the Buddha became, or a wheel-turning monarch, turning the Dharma wheel in secular life for the benefit of society. And if you were at Sangha maybe some weeks ago, you may have heard Taranita talking about this and giving a real-life historical example of the King Ashoka. So it's good to pick out the legendary stories of wheel-turning kings because they show the Buddha as being concerned with the social conditions for suffering in his time. In the Buddha's time, as in ours, there was poverty, homelessness, many wars, and a social structure that was dominated by caste. So male Brahmin priests were the only ones, for example, thought capable of sacred knowledge. The Buddha's Sangha was radical. Worldly wealth and distinctions had no place in his Sangha. The Sangha contained men and women, rich and poor, high and low caste. And in fact, if you left the household life to join the Buddha's Sangha, you were effectively taking a step out of all caste and all class distinctions. The follower of the Buddha was called a samana simply, which means recluse. In one story, for example, two Brahmin students asked the Buddha what he thinks about caste. And this is just a taster of the verses that he says in reply. With humans, no differences of birth make a distinctive mark in them, nor in the hairs, nor in the head, nor in the hands, nor in the feet, nor in their colour, nor in their voice. Here birth makes no distinctive mark. And in another story, we get a glimpse of what the Buddha encouraged as being a good society. So instead of the usual, what seemed to be sort of bloody and oppressive rituals of sacrifice that were often carried out, the Buddha said you should offer things like milk and butter. And best of all, oneself. Yourself is the offering. You offer yourself and your ethical practice. So in one story it said, "In this sacrifice, Brahmin, no bulls were slain, no goats or sheep, nor were various living beings subjected to slaughter, nor were trees cut down for sacrificial posts, nor were grasses mown for the sacrificial grass. And those who are called slaves or servants or workmen did not perform their tasks for fear of blows and threats, weeping and in tears. But those who wanted to do something did it, and those who did not want to did not." So this story here that I've told just now of our good but somewhat misguided king fits into this theme of social issues in the early Buddhist texts. And I read the sutta some weeks ago, and it's been following me around actually, because it does seem to me to speak to some of the issues that we're facing at the moment in a very challenging world, when perhaps as Dharma practitioners we're trying to figure out how to engage. So it's mythic, it's simple, and it's a kind of parable for our times. The first message I take from this parable is the very straightforward one that social conditions matter. Partly just in the obvious sense that who is the king matters. Who is in political power, which institutions dominate, which economic systems we have. All this has massive power to either injure or protect, or even create or destroy. So we know all this, and we can think of many examples. But it's partly also that political governance, culture, our institutions, our complex social and economic influences, they condition our minds. They deeply affect individual consciousness. So as in the story where the king's subjects turn to the bad, following his foolish actions, they steal when stealing is rewarded, they kill, following his example of killing. So we too can be encouraged to the good, or we can turn to the bad. We can be encouraged to turn to the bad by these complex social influences in our time. So I think maybe we think, or maybe I think that I'm quite aware of that, but I suspect that those influences go deeper than we know consciously, and they go very deep. And sometimes I imagine alternative situations to get a sense of this. So how about if instead of advertising, which constantly sort of trades on our dissatisfaction, exploits our anxieties, drives us to want more and more, and then tells us it's not enough and we want something more again. How about instead of that, we were bombarded, by catchphrases such as, "Be content with less," or "Have you had any time doing nothing today?" How about that on an advertising billboard? Or instead of, "You are what you wear," "You are totally lovable." So what would those messages do to our collective consciousnesses? Can we imagine that? It would be nice to think that as Dharma practitioners, we're above all these influences, and at any rate, I'm sure we do our best. But there's a very nice quote from Sangharakshita once. He said, "It's all very well to talk about the lotus blooming in the midst of the mire, but it's very difficult to be a lotus when the mire is particularly nasty or particularly all-pervasive." And yet, of course, we can also look at it from another direction. So I can't think of any suffering in the world that's not ultimately caused by what the Buddha called the fires of greed, hatred, and delusion in individuals. Where else are they apart from in individuals? So we could say that these are the internal individual conditions rather than the external social conditions. So the internal causes lie at the root, and they must be uprooted. And at the end of our parable story, the Buddha sums up by saying, I do not consider any power so hard to conquer as the power of Mara. So in other words, as Jayarava said last week, the conditions for suffering lie in the human mind and where we have been ethical or unethical. And it's worth repeating the verses that he quoted from the Dhammapada. Experiences are preceded by mind, led by mind, produced by mind. If one speaks or acts with an impure mind, suffering follows even as the cartwheel follows the hoof of the ox. Experiences are preceded by mind, led by mind, produced by mind. If one speaks or acts with a pure mind, happiness follows like a shadow that never departs. So in reality, we have a dance between world inside and world outside, individual and society, a mutual conditioning. And that's why actually we need two wheels. We need a turning of the wheel in the social sphere, because otherwise we will reproduce the external conditions for suffering in all their many forms. A modern day wheel turning monarch would be very good, but in the sad absence of that, the glaring absence of that perhaps, we need to find ways to wheel turn ourselves in the social sphere. But, and more fundamentally, we need the turning of the wheel in the spiritual sphere. Otherwise, we'll keep misunderstanding and reproducing the very root causes of suffering in the human heart and mind. So where we put our energy and talents in terms of action and practice as Dharma practitioners is another question. As Satchalila said on Sunday, we all have different temperaments. As a Sangha, we have different inclinations, interests, capabilities, and these change over time. And I was reading a friend's poem recently, and it was about him in his 20s, and I was brought to think about how I was in my 20s. And I realised that the times then that I felt most alive were the times when I'd been on various demonstrations in London, some of them quite lively, in the 70s, late 70s and 80s, on issues that I was passionate about. Or I was fly posting, or disrupting auctions to try and prevent takeovers by profiteering landlords, into all that stuff. And then there was quite a few years of intense work in legal aid and in environmental law. And now, many of you know, I live a quiet life in comparison. You know, you might see me on the odd demonstration, but mainly I'm meditating, studying, talking the Dharma with friends. So life looks very different, but that's not so much to do with the fact that I'm older, although maybe that has a part in it. And it's not really to do with the fact that I'm a Buddhist now. It's more that different aspects of me have come to the fore at different times and need expression. And I think that's the thing for us. The important thing is that as a Sangha, we're united in our understanding and practice of the Dharma. But that means that we may assist in turning the wheel of the Dharma in different spheres in different times, either the social sphere or the spiritual sphere, or both. So getting back to our story, It's incredibly poignant, isn't it, that in our story, people don't start to wake up to the suffering until it's almost too late, until their lives have reduced, their kinsfolk have been killed, and people are so isolated and divided against each other that in the end they fail to even recognize each other as human. Bearing sharp swords, they thought, this is a wild beast, I must kill it. So doesn't that sound tragically familiar? And it sometimes seems to me that we have to reach those extremes of suffering, sadly, before we turn back. It takes a climate emergency for more of us to face the consequences of consumerism. It takes news of a police murder of a black man, revealing shocking disregard for a black life, for more of us to become more alive to what racism does to people. And on some level, most of the time, there's a level on which we don't want to know. We ignore, we turn away, whether that's on the scale of big world issues or on the scale of our own difficulties, wherever we feel challenged to move out of our own comfort zone, really. And on a personal, everyday level, I've been reflecting a lot on my own complacency during lockdown, noticing that painful desire to retreat and be satisfied in the comfort of my sort of Pleasant St Andrews cocoon. And more than that, just all the avoidings I do, the comfort seeking, the want to be with people like me, views like mine, places where I won't be challenged, and just missing the chance to grow. I remember today an anecdote meditating very well and things were really opening up when elbows and whoosh, he's off his cushion to get his. So he commented in his book, Riley, Vimalavajri, you want, awakening or another cup of tea. So the change in consciousness that the Buddha experienced is radical. It's a deep turning about. And it's based on seeing things as they actually are. It's natural to turn away, to want to dull out, or to ignore, or to retreat into habit. But the thing is, when you're aware, when I'm aware that this is what you're doing, you know that ignorance just isn't a solution. And in fact, ignoring itself is painful. So what to do? Compassion for that ignorance seems the only answer. Faced with ignorance, I just need to find something big enough to hold it. Forcing engagement with difficulties never works in my experience. What does work, or can work, is inviting compassion if I'm open to it. Opening to the compassion which actually is always there. And which doesn't have a problem with ignoring. In a way, compassion can't ignore. And allowing that compassion to touch me, and allowing the compassion to move me on. And to connect with others who also ignore. We're all in the same ignorant boat, actually. Our story people do reach a point where they stop and they're prepared to see what's going on. At the very bottom of this descent of society into complete chaos, there's that beautiful moment when some of them look at what's happened and they say, no, this way creates suffering and we do not assent to it. Let us not kill or be killed by anyone. It's the pivot of the story, the moment when hope returns. And at that point, struck by the fact that our story people first just withdraw. Let us make for some grassy thickets, or forest clearings, or rivers that are hard to ford, and live on roots and fruits of the forest. But this is not a withdrawing that's about ignoring, denial. It's because they need to withdraw before they do anything else. They found places where there would be safety, refreshment, food, solitude. And I was thinking that this often needs to be our first step, metaphorically or sometimes literally. We need to be well-resourced, nourished and refreshed ourselves. Otherwise, our engagement won't be sustained. We may need space to connect, to be compassionately present with ourselves and our experience, whatever that may be. And we also need often, I think, to pause and reflect before acting. Otherwise, we'll probably be reacting from some habit, a habit of some kind, rather than responding wisely. It's just so tempting to try and fix problems, to work out strategies for getting rid of difficulties, because bearing with them is hard, it's painful, unpleasant. We want to make it better. It's a bit like scratching an itch. Not an itch. So it's a great relief when I scratch an itch, but actually often it makes things worse. You know, I'd be better off waiting a bit and deciding what medicine to apply. Satyalila said, I think a few Sangha nights ago, that it's important to know when to act and when not to act. But if we step back, we've taken space, found what we need, at some point we have to come out and engage. Or do we? And why? Thinking of our story people withdrawn into their forest clearings, their hiding places, I found myself wondering, well, what drew them out? Why didn't they stay there where they knew it was safe, where they were at peace, had enough to eat? So maybe they were lonely, maybe they ran out of food, but I like to believe that something in them knew that they would need to tread a path to a new society together, and that isolation wouldn't bring them peace and happiness in the long term. I like to believe that deep inside they sense their common humanity that connects us so much more fundamentally than any of our differences. The basic human connection that they refound when they emerged, and they said to each other joyfully, "You are alive." And maybe also, without even having words for it, they felt the urge to go beyond, to transcend the human predicament. So they knew somewhere that the path they would tread with others would at long last take them home to their true nature, not separate from life. So emerging from their hiding places, our story people began a long journey toward freedom. They have each other, proto-Sangha, and we feel at that point we can look into their future with confidence. Now they've taken the first steps on the spiral path, because one skillful step leads naturally to another. Positives gather and rivers flow into the great ocean. So eventually, the conditions build for the arising of the awakened mind, and a Buddha appears among them, reaching, as it says at the end of the sutta, that pure liberation of heart and liberation by wisdom attained in this very life. No doubt some future king in this land will turn out to be a wheel-turning monarch, and will then have come full circle. That's the end of today's story. Go well.
Thank you.